After an embarrassing defeat at the hands of their division rival, Las Vegas Raiders, the LA Chargers fired their head coach, Brandon Staley, and a lot of people are saying that he never should have been hired or they regret ever saying he'll be a head coach. Now, I can't speak on other people's behalf, but I will say I loved Staley when he got hired. But now, hindsight's 2020, he's obviously a coordinator, not a head coach. Just simply not. Despite this, I have no issue whatsoever with how the Chargers went about hiring Staley. Even though it didn't work, I hate that people are now acting like this was just obvious from the beginning. The second Staley came in, we knew he was going to fail, because that very much was not the case. In my mind, there's three approaches to hiring head coaches. There's the first and least common one, more of an old school approach, where you grow an assistant coach from inside the organization, and when the current head coach retires because he gets old, you promote this assistant coach so you can maintain the culture and just keep winning games. Things just flow directly from one coaching regime to the next, right? It has its fair share of positives when it works right. There's not many current examples of it working that great, though. I would say the best example of how it can work, though, is after Bill Walsh retired, George Seifert came in and won 2 Super Bowls with the 49ers. Now, there are examples of this today. I just wouldn't say that they're overwhelmingly great. Dennis Allen is the main one that comes to mind if you're talking about today's league. And that one, and it seems like this can happen a lot when you take this approach, binded the Saints to mediocrity. And now they're stuck in this weird spot where they're like, we're not quite good enough to contend, but we kind of went all in like we're going to contend. So they're in a really weird spot because of that. And I think sometimes that can happen if you drag out the amount of time that a certain coaching staff or disciples from that coaching staff remain on a team, right? It is a quick path to mediocrity most of the time. That's why you don't see teams do it that much anymore. Like I said, it can work, but it's not overly common. The other approach, and this is one that you see a lot more, is the safe approach, where you bring in a former head coach who wasn't overly great, but they weren't awful. You do this because you want a head coach that has experience as the head coach of a NFL team, but you know that they don't have an overwhelmingly high ceiling. It can work out, and the big thing there is you have someone that has experience, right? When a head coach's stint with a team comes to an end due to the team performing below expectation, but not necessarily awful, and then they become a coordinator for a couple years, a team might be willing to give that specific coach the benefit of the doubt and offer them a second head coaching job, see if maybe something just went wrong the last time. Or maybe that last tenure as a assistant coach really taught them what they need to know. That's at least the thought process when you do something like this. Examples are Belichick going from Cleveland's head coach in the early 90s to New England's in the 2000s and 2010s. Andy Reid going from a 13-year tenure in Philly to being a Super Bowl champion with the Kansas City Chiefs. And, of course, Pete Carroll is an example of this. He was with the Jets and Patriots as a head coach in the 90s and then went to Seattle in the 2010s. The big difference with him, though, is instead of being on another NFL team's coaching staff, he coached in college for a little bit and was successful. Now, you hear about those three guys, and you know how their career played out. It makes you say, why don't all teams do this? If you are guaranteed to get a head coach of those three's caliber, why would you not always go with this safe approach? Well, that's because it isn't a guarantee. There's examples that haven't worked out too well, like Josh McDaniels and Frank Reich, who both got fired this year. And it also doesn't look too good for guys like Ron Rivera, who was a head coach on Carolina, got fired, and then pretty much instantly got hired by Washington to be their head coach. None of those three guys have done much since leaving their original team, and I don't think that's going to be changing anytime soon, as two of those guys are fired. One of them remains in the league, but is likely gone after the season comes to a close. But now I want to talk about the third way. The third way includes Brandon Staley. It was the same process the Chargers used when they hired him. This third, more aggressive approach is when you bring in a top-notch assistant from another organization. The Chargers are in a terrible spot for the future now. There is no denying that. Yes, they have Herbert, but next year, he'll be playing on his fifth-year option. And after that, he becomes a huge cap hit for them. When they signed Staley, Herbert was coming off a phenomenal rookie year, and it looked like they were in a great spot to take advantage of his relatively low cap hit over the next 4 years. Okay, so we wasted Herbert's rookie contract for the most part. But what young players did he bring in that are currently playing well on cheap contracts? You know, maybe you waste the cheap years of Herbert's deal, but it's really a waste if you brought in other young building blocks that you are going to utilize to build the rest of your roster. Well, it doesn't get much better, because in 2021, which was their best draft class under Staley, they brought in Rashawn Slater, Asante Samuel, and Josh Palmer, who was an okay player, but not quite worth a third rounder if you ask me. 2022 was even worse. They brought in first rounder Zion Johnson, who has been awful. And they didn't have their second rounder because they did a trade for an aging and highly paid Khalil Mack. But what about their third round pick and on? They did nothing with them. I mean, everyone that they drafted with those picks have been virtually useless. I know I'm not in the practices. Maybe those guys are great practice players, but none of these guys have done much when asked to play in-game, right? And 2023 has looked awful so far. Quentin Johnston has looked like one of the worst picks of the entire draft. Tui Peloto, I'll give him his credit. He is playing very well when he's on the field. But once again, we return to a bunch of completely irrelevant players beyond that. Just looking back at these draft classes, I have two worrying observations. One, they were awful at drafting late. I'm not asking them to draft the next Brock Purdy, but everyone drafted round 4 or later has been a complete non-factor, even as rotational guys. And then two, I would say they only hit on 4 out of 24 of those draft picks. And I'm being very loose with the term hit here because I am counting Josh Palmer, just because he's a contributor. Even though I just said earlier, he wasn't worth a third rounder, but at least he's contributing. Compared to the other guys, this really should be 3 out of 24, but I'm giving Palmer the benefit of the doubt. In all fairness, he has played behind 2 really good wideouts. Still, 4 out of 24 isn't good at all. It really isn't. I know drafting isn't completely on the head coach, but good coaches can elevate their homegrown talent. And Staley, along with his staff, completely failed to do that. You can't build an entire team on the transaction wire, but that's what the Chargers tried to do. And of course, it didn't translate. This team was expected to have playoff success, and they just simply did not. The Chargers only had one playoff berth under Staley, and in it, they choked away a 27-point lead over the Jacksonville Jaguars. A lot of the time, I like to blame absolute collapses like that on the head coach, and I was very surprised when they brought Staley back for the 2023 NFL season. The facts are that he had a couple of off seasons to warp the roster to better fit his visions. But the defense remained awful, allowing 27 points per game in 2021, which was 29th, 22 in 2022, which is 21st. Then, as of the day Staley was fired, 24.6 in 2023, which is 27th. Keep in mind, Staley is a defensive-minded head coach, and that's one of the major red flags. When a coach is supposed to specialize in a certain aspect of the game, yet that area completely sucks for 3 years straight, despite devoting a lot of assets to it, that's always a bad sign. And the reason I say they allocated so many assets to the defense is because they've been top 10 in money spent on the defensive side of the ball in each of the past 3 off seasons. Staley's defensive philosophy was supposed to be revolutionary, when in actuality, it was a liability. Now, you may look at the title of this video and still be questioning, when are you going to start defending this move? Because so far, I have only went over how it didn't work out. Well, in order to understand that, I need you to forget everything that we learned about Staley in this past 3 seasons. Forget the terrible defensive performances. Forget the terrible decisions on 4th downs. We have to go back in time to the offseason of 2021. A lot of people downplay Staley's tenure with the Rams as him just being a talent merchant. But when your defense is allowing 4.5 yards per play, the fewest passing yards in the NFL, and only 17 passing touchdowns, along with allowing the lowest point total on the season, that's more than just talent. The Rams' utilization of light boxes and softer coverage that was often disguised to look completely different pre-snap than it was post-snap was a nightmare for the modern pass-heavy offenses. Along with seemingly having the formula to consistently stop teams like the Chiefs and Bills, 2 of the top teams in the league at the time, he also had experience coaching up some of the best players at one of the most valuable positions. He was an outside linebacker coach for the Bears in 2017 and 2018. He helped Khalil Mack have one of his single best seasons of his career and finish second in Defensive Player of the Year voting in 2018, and worked with the great Von Miller and a young Bradley Chubb for a little bit before he got hurt on the 2019 Broncos. While with Denver and Chicago, he learned from another recent revolutionary defensive mind in Vic Fangio. Teams envied that Fangio scheme and were willing to hire anyone that could bring that scheme to their team. That, along with his ability to develop star pass rushers, really made teams want him, and want him bad. Add that phenomenal 2020 Rams defense to that resume, all of a sudden you have one of the most heavily desired head coaching candidates in all of football. People are acting like this approach is flawed, when in reality, it's just risky. I get that it's a young coordinator who never played the role of a head coach, but there's nothing wrong with taking risks like that. Very similar risks have worked out for the Vikings with Kevin O'Connell, Miami with Mike McDaniel, the Texans with DeMeco Ryans, and the Indianapolis Colts with Shane Steichen. Those are just recent examples, by the way. Staley is an example of how this can blow up in your team's face, but the fact is, if you want to get a home run, you got to swing big. The 49ers did it, they got Kyle Shanahan. The Rams did it, they got Sean McVay. The Chargers did it, and they striked out. They can aim for a single this next upcoming at-bat and go with a safe coach this time, or they could swing big once again and aim for the home run. No matter what their approach is now, they're on the plate. Thank you all for watching my video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and feel free to subscribe if you want to see more of my content. Also, feel free to comment down below. Who do you think the Chargers should bring in to be their head coach during the offseason?